So before I go on my talk today, I just want you guys to, thanks for coming to the event, and it's honestly it's been such a thrill for me, and I hope it's been a thrill for you guys. So here we go. So I woke up one day, and I started having these really, really weird thoughts. I looked at the wall of my house, and it was white. I opened the window to get a breath of fresh air, and I noticed that the sky was blue and that the grass was green. The year was 2015. My name started with an S. And the United States was well on its way to its 48th president, and I got the privilege to be living in an age of technological development. And then I had an epiphany. For certain things to be how they are now, for us to be where we are right now, the events that preceded it must have occurred in such a specific manner that any little change in the initial conditions would mean it would change everything. But we know that that's not how the world works, right? We can't just take some inconsequential, minute variable like the degree of weather yesterday and say that that will turn the tide of battle within a decade. No, we're smart enough and intuitively we know that that's not how the world works. Or does it? To understand the underlying concept and conundrum that's going on in this problem, we have to go back and understand chaos theory. And even before that, we have to understand Newton. You see, Newton was this kind of guy that really didn't like chaos theory. And before the 20th century, everybody believed in what he thought was called Newtonian determinism. Give me a number, punch it into one of his equations, and I can calculate any moving object and where it will be. Have enough current information, we can predict the future. Predictability was nothing but a breeze. One of the great epitomes of Newton's ideal thing in his time was that this is the grand orrery. Essentially, you would turn this thing, and it would spin, the planets would rotate, and you could calculate anything. This is what Newton thought of the universe as. Nothing more complex than a clockwork machine. Many people believe Newton was a gift given to us from God. For the first time in our lives in human history, because of him, we could calculate the movement and trajectories of celestial and heavenly bodies like the stars. But we know that that's not true anymore, and that chaos is all around us. It wasn't until a century ago a scientist named Poincare told us that chaos was all around us and Newton's world was shattered. About 52 years ago, there was an MIT mathematics professor, and he was also a meteorologist. And as all meteorologists like to do, they would like to predict the weather accurately and for long periods of time. Now, what this guy was trying to do was do it for a month. A little crazy in the head. Now, he decided to take a coffee break one day, and that changed the world forever. The way that his program worked was he put in a set of differential equations, and I'll get to that in a moment. And essentially, you put in a number, and it shows a sequence of a wave or a graph. So he wanted to look at one specific trajectory in detail. He punched in the code, started the sequence midway, went to go grab a cup of coffee and do what meteorologists like to do, use the bathroom or something. So he came back, and what he had seen on his computer screen was extremely different from that of which he had expected. Now, what you should be seeing here is just a straight line, or rather a line that's curvy, but just one line. Within a virtual day, that's what it seems so. Within a virtual week, two roads diverged. And within a virtual month, you couldn't even tell that these two lines were coming from the same parameters. What was going on here? You see, Lorenz, much to his dismay, checked the tube on the computer, reran scans, and he said, aha, I figured it out. He looked at the printout on his computer and saw that the original parameters he had put in, 0.506127, was actually rounded to 0.506. So he found the culprit. Okay, cool. That still got Lorenz's head scratching. How can something as minute as changing 1,000th and rounding it to the 1,000th have such a big effect to change the weather? He looked at this idea and said, hey, big things or small things can lead to extremely big things. He proposed this idea to his colleagues and his peers in a meeting, and he said this was in his subject. Predictability: could the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Brazil cause a tornado in Texas? Sounds weird, right? Inadvertently, he had created a beautiful thing known as the butterfly effect. And the fundamental theory that this was based off of is known as chaos theory. So essentially, he had created something that is amazing for all of us to look at. Now, what is a good example of the chaos theory? Well, before we get into that, we must know that a law was born between both. An amazing law and a law of sensitive dependency on initial conditions. Well, Sam, what does that mean? It sounds like a bunch of gibberish to me. Essentially, what the law of sensitive dependency states is that within a complex system or a nonlinear dynamical system, the outcome or results of what happens in there is so highly dependent and so extremely sensitive to initial conditions. What's a good example of this? Take, for example, the double pendulum. All you need to know is that it's a stick attached to a circle, attached to a stick, attached to a circle, and one of the circles are stable. Now, if you look at the animation here, I would be willing to bet my entire checkings account that you could not predict where this will end up if you actually had one. If you had two of the double pendulums, you would not be able to, no matter how hard you tried, no matter with the brain of Einstein, or no matter with all the supercomputers in the world, predict where this will end up. And if you somehow do end up, predicting it, you won't get much out of my checkings account anyway. So, there's that. So what are some examples of the law of sensitive dependency to initial conditions? I'll give you two historical anecdotes. One day, there was this man who felt that the nation of his country was oppressed. He felt that the unifications were unnecessary, and he was really upset. He took his anger out on two people. He pulled up a gun and shot them both. What this man realized he had done was cause a riot and kill two very important people. What this man didn't realize he had done was lead to the death of 16 million soldiers and casualties that exceeded 20 million. His name was Gavrilo Princip, and you've probably guessed it by now. He's killed and shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Duchess of Hohenberg, and started World War I. Another example, I'm sure you're all familiar with Rosa Parks, and how one cranky afternoon for her turned into an ignition of a tinderbox that is the civil rights movement. Now, whether you would like to disagree and conflict that Montgomery bus boycott was all due to her feeling cranky or stubborn, or whether it was set up, one thing's for sure, her contributions are magnanimous and they're unintended. A couple years later, she decided to create the Montgomery Institute of Advancement, short for MIA, not missing in action. That's terrible. And she decided that she wanted a president speaker. Rosa Parks and her peers looked round and round and round, and they decided to settle with someone that's lesser known, and a lesser-known pastor from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. What Rosa Parks realized she had done was given a guy a chance. What Rosa Parks didn't realize she had done was birth one of the greatest figures in the civil rights history and in the United States history. This same man would go on to say, "I have a dream." His name was Martin Luther King Jr., and the rest is history. So how do we understand the butterfly effect and chaos theory without something as lame as the double pendulum, but a little bit more complicated and mathematical for you science kids out there? We'll start off with this bad guy. Now, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. This is what's known as a differential equation. Now, for those of you who aren't going into a math career, thank God for you. And those of you who are going, rest in peace. You're going to have to deal with that. So essentially what is special about this is that this is not your average algebraic traditional function. These are functions that are based off of other variables. And the answer is not one individual number, but a function itself. Essentially, what Lorentz had done was he had created this, simplified, derived, until he had came up with this function. And essentially, what this did was model convective fluid flow. And I'm very sure you're all familiar with convection currents, how hot air rises up to the air, becomes less dense, and then it becomes cool, gets more dense, and rises to the bottom. So what happens when you graph it? You will get something that looks like this. It is an amazing and beautiful object, and it is known as the Lorentz attractor. This will become your best friend in understanding chaos theory and the butterfly effect. Let's look at it when it's in animation. So the first important thing to note here is that it starts spinning in a circle, and quite predictably so. You might say, Sam, what's unpredictable about that thing right there? Well, in the first few seconds of its birth, nothing's unpredictable about that. That actually accounts for why we can only predict weather up to 7 days and precipitation up to 3. As we go away from the birth, the particle starts moving in random areas. It's almost unpredictable. The important thing to know here is that when we look at the outline, it's not that unpredictable at all. Although it might seem something of a chaotic motion, it has an outline, it has a maximum, it has a minimum, it doesn't go past a certain point. That's the important thing to see here. Things that might seem random aren't necessarily that random at all. And when we look at it from a different perspective, like I'm sitting here right now, we can see that it's deterministic. Essentially, a Harvard professor decided that he would build a circuit board and a circuit, and he would put capacitors in certain locations. He punched it into an oscilloscope, and this is what he got. This is the action of the Lorentz attractor. So what are some real-life implementations of chaos theory? How can such an esoteric skill be used in real life? Funny about that. The National Weather Service now does what's called ensemble forecasting. They essentially take Lorentz's equations, punch it in a bunch of times in different initial conditions, take the averages of those initial conditions, and that's how they give us our weather today. Those inputs are labeled perturbations 1 through 20. And they take the average of those. Certain spots in Earth actually have really large averages that deviate, and they look at these and call them chaos hotspots. They zone in on them just to give us more accurate weather. Another really interesting way that I think you guys will like how the chaos theory is used is in success of marital status. Now that sounds interesting, right? Well, essentially what happens is two scientists, a psychologist named John Gottman and a physicist named James Murray, looked at 700 couples over the intensity of a decade. They made their own differential equations. They made their own little equation, and they put in variables. And the variables consisted of, after viewing these couples, how many times they raised their eyebrows to each other, how many times they smiled to each other, how many times they hugged, how many times they kissed. You know, you guys should be able to deal with that. What these two scientists have found out was that after studying this, they were able to predict the specific exact time of how long these couples would last in 94% of the time. They could even write a friggin' movie about that, man. That is so cool. Speaking of movies, I like movies. I like movies where they tinker with the idea of going back in time to prevent something from happening. But we all know that that's not that simple. Every movie we've watched, everything Hollywood's produced has shown us that every time we go back in time to try to fix something, try to fix an embarrassing moment, we realize that we end up creating another timeline. One of my favorite movies is Back to the Future. Who likes Back to the Future here? I really like that movie, but it doesn't work out when you take into consideration chaos theory and the butterfly effect. Essentially, what the law of sensitive dependency states is it states that there are paradoxes that occur when you travel back in time. Let's think of one right now. Let's think of the grandfather paradox. Essentially, let's say that you travel back in time on a time machine and you have a gun and you want to end up killing your grandfather. For whatever reason, I have no idea, but let's say you want to end up killing your grandfather. You do, and three things happen here. One of three things. One, you either cease to exist. You've killed the man that is your only source of being birthed in the world. Thus, your parents would never meet, and you would never be birthed. Two, and this is less popular among scientists, you would create a separate timeline. And three, you would be stuck in an endless loop of where you travel back in time, shoot your grandfather, cease to exist, go back to the nearest point in which you were alive, travel back in time, shoot your grandfather, cease to exist. But let's get into some semantics, some really technical and difficult stuff that I like to think about when I think about the butterfly effect. How many of you would agree with me if I said, what if Hitler ceased to exist today? Or what if Hitler ceased to exist? Would the world be different today? Can I get a show of hands? How many people would think that? Interesting. For those of you who have raised your hands, you have already given in to the law of sensitive dependency on initial conditions. But let's actually think about that for a second. What if Hitler was never born? As Mark Perkelbest states, the Earth would still go around the sun, the Earth would still rotate, and planets would do their thing. But this is what he said. I'm willing to admit that everyone in this room, as a matter of fact, I'm willing to go as far and say everybody in this earth, except for very, very, very few amounts of old people, except for those guys, would not exist today. We would never have been born and created the way we are now, and we would have not known each other how we know each other now. That is how much of an impact Hitler has had on our life. And it's a fairly interesting thing to think about when we go in terms of length and time. What if I was there to show Hitler love and kindness when he got rejected to his art school? What if I was there to prevent Hitler's parents from ever meeting or ate their wedding cake and messed it all up by a second? What if I was there to steal the love life of Hitler's dad? Everything would be different today. So, the butterfly effect in chaos theory. It's a magnificent idea. It's this idea that small things have really big outcomes. From the moment you've walked in here and listened to every little speaker today, from the moment you've paid attention, you have made more impact on yourself and everyone around you in the world than I have attempted to you. From the beating of your heart right now to the amount of carbon dioxide you're emitting, you are affecting everybody around you and the world. Now, whether our life, whether our future is a determined intricacy from the things that we have done in the present, and the past is essentially a foreshadowing of that event, we don't know for sure. But one thing's for sure, we no longer live in Newton's world of determinism. Everything is chaotic around us, and predictability is far within our grasp. We are able to predict the movement of planets 1,000 years ahead of time, but we cannot accurately and reliably predict where the wind will blow in the next hour. Our lives are more intertwined than you can ever imagine. An inch of happiness can span across generations into a mile of kindness. A grain of hatred can blow up into a desert of destruction that spans millenniums. Whether our future, our life, as human beings is nothing but a finishing mathematical equation waiting to end, or it is an aperiodic motion waiting to be chaotic, or it is nothing but simply the divine push from a finger of God, that is not for me to decide. That is for you to think and ponder. Thank you so much, guys.
Dacula, stand up and give Mr. Samuel Wan a huge round of applause. Sometimes you just end the day on the absolute highest note that you could possibly end it. And it's with our very own Samuel Wan. Outstanding job today. Thank you so much for sharing. And what I want to do, along with Sam, is bring up all of the speakers that have presented today. If you will, at this time, make your way to the stage. And TEDxDaculaHighSchool, while our speakers are walking to the stage, I want you, with every amount of energy and enthusiasm that you have, give them one more huge round of applause as they come up.
Spain, Mr. Spain, man. Thanks,
Keep
man.
it going, keep it going, keep it going, keep it going.
Lafayette, man.
Once again, we've been a part of history today. Outstanding job from all of you. Our lives will never, ever be the same because of the time that you spent with us today and the impact that you've made on our lives. This day could not have been possible without the leadership of one guy in particular, and I think we all know who I'm talking about. Listen, come on, Chris Larkins. Where are you, Chris? Chris! Wow. Thank you, man. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to give some final remarks.
I know some of you guys have to leave, especially the band competition. But just to say a few things, this means so much to me. It truly does. If, like I said before, if just one of you takes something away from this and does something to improve Dacula and to improve the world, that will mean everything to me. And what means even more than that is the fact that this event right here was basically all student run. Your very own Dacula High School made this possible. So if all the camera crew, everyone, Austin, Cam, Fabi, Andrew, Azar, all you guys, the TEDx team, come up here. It's just... They all made it happen. This event would not be here if it wasn't for all these students who came in here and helped out, along with you guys who attended. So once again, thank you very much, and have a great day.
Did you hear mine, Mr. Spain?
I did. I was there the whole time.
Oh, man.
Well done.
Thank you, sir.
Well done. Your microphone's still on.
Oh,
Where's Mario? Thank you, Mario.
awesome, man. Awesome. Hey, awesome. Thank you.
Hey, have a good trip back to New York, man.
Let's-
Keep up the good work.
Never in New York City. You can reach out. We'll give you the tour.
Thank you.
Again, man.